conflict, within and without. It seeks to understand what should be done in such circumstances. In midst of such turmoil, must women wait for their turn, or do these battles need to be fought simultaneously? To answer this question, I'd like to invite on stage our moderator for the panel, journalist Marusha Muzaffar, Chairperson, Jammu and Kashmir State Commission for Women, Naeema Ahmed Mahjoor, academic, Samreen Mushtaq, bureaucrat, Mantasha Binti Rashid, activist, Shaila Rashid Shora, and journalist, Freni Maneksha.
Hello and welcome everyone. My name is Marusha Muzaffar, and this morning we have an amazing group of people with us. To my right is Samreen Mushtaq. She's from Baramulla in Kashmir. She's currently pursuing her PhD, her research at Jamia Millia Islamia. Her research work focuses on gender-based violence and armed conflict in the valley. Next to her is Naeema Ahmed Mahjoor, former editor, BBC. Naeema Ahmed Mahjoor. She's a former editor, BBC Urdu Service. She has also authored 2 books, Lost in Kashmir and Dehshat Zadi. Currently, she is chairperson, State Commission for Women, Jammu and Kashmir. Next to her is Mantasha Binti Rashid. She is undersecretary in the government of Jammu and Kashmir and founder of support network for women called Kashmir Women's Collective. She's also a research scholar on gender and violence from University of Westminster and a Fulbright scholar in gender and policy from State University of New York. Next to her is Shaila Rashid. She's former vice president, JNU Students Union, pursuing her PhD right now. Freni Maneksha, she's an independent journalist interested in development in human rights issues. She's written extensively about Kashmir. She's authored a book called Behold, I Shine, Narratives of Kashmir's Women and Children. I think it's a brilliant opportunity for us today to understand from our panelists what violence does to women in conflict areas. We'll try and understand the implications it has on the lives and choices that women make in the valley, in conflict zones anywhere around the world, especially focusing on Kashmir here. And whether the movement for gender equality can run parallel to the civil resistance movement in Kashmir. I'll start with Shaila. Shaila, you grew up in downtown Srinagar, in Habba could you give us a sense of what it was like growing up in Kashmir when militancy was unfolding around you? What are the earliest memories you have from that period? How did it shape you, a woman, a girl growing up, witnessing all this?
Thank you for the question, Marusha. Good morning, everyone. Hello to my fellow panelists. It's really wonderful to have 5 Kashmiri women on a panel together. Thanks for putting us there. You are honorary Kashmiri. I would first like to begin by condemning the attack on women journalists that took place yesterday at the hands of Delhi police when there was a march being organized by JNU students. And students were attacked, but at the same time, journalists were also attacked. So this is really condemnable. When we go back to Kashmir, when we go back to downtown Srinagar, that is where the hub of insurgency was. The hub of armed insurgency in the 80s was downtown Srinagar, where I come from. And I don't talk much about this because it's also a very difficult thing to recollect. It's also very, there are a couple of painful memories, I would say. I was born in the year 1988, and that's pretty much when the insurgency was brewing, or when it basically broke out. I have 3 kinds of things to say about what I remember from that period. The first thing is that you didn't know that there was a conflict because there was so much censorship that things were happening right in front of you. I do remember gunshots being fired. I do remember people, being paraded with that black thing on their heads, and basically militants who were caught. And I do remember there was a school next to our. So I grew up in Habakadal, in a neighborhood called Sona Masjid. Now, in Sona Masjid, there is something called a Raghunath Mandir, which is in shambles right now. But at that time, it was so there was some kind of a debate at my house whether we should be sent to a private school or to the Mandir school. Marusha and I have actually studied at the same school. My parents finally decided to put us in a private school. But what was this Mandir school? This Mandir school was basically the Mandir, the deserted Raghunath Mandir, which was actually a very grand temple. But by then it was deserted. And in its premises, there was a government school being run. So that is, it was right in front of you that the mandir is deserted. It was right in front of you that the militants are being caught. Everything was right in front of you. It's just that we never talk about it. And even when you see news, news would be just, Doordarshan news. We didn't have cable or Dish TV for the longest time. So it was just Doordarshan. And what Doordarshan would give you is a very sanitized government version of things, as to what is happening. There's no real news there. This is the first kind of thing, the censorship. The second kind of thing is you would actually know this incident, right? My Masi, that is my mother's youngest sister, she was actually injured in a bomb blast. And she nearly lost her arm, and it was through a miraculous surgery that was fixed back. And she's leading a happy life now. But even at that time, even when that happened, even though the experience was like so personal, and all of us kids, we were so close to her, and she took like 4 years to recover, we never really talked about the conflict. There was just no talk. And the third kind of memory is, just your experiences as women. So I would describe gender as my entry point into politicization or politics or whatever. And you see broken homes around you. You see a lot of domestic violence happening around you. There was someone who was very close to us, and she was a newly married bride. And as you know, at that time, stoves were going up, kerosene stoves were going up throughout the country. This is when dowry deaths were actually pretty common. So at one level, what I want to say is that at one level, Kashmir is so different, but at another level, it's just the same. When dowry deaths were happening all around the country, we did have dowry deaths there, so Kashmir is not really alien to these things. What is different though is, we would hear about, of course, sexual harassment and all of that harassment on buses. I have myself been very outspoken about that. But rape, we didn't really hear much about rape. It's probably just that there was probably more silence then, or as a society, in Kashmiri language, we don't actually have a term for rape. We don't have a local term for rape. But zyadti, yeah, that's correct. So that's probably what it connotes. But today we see much more. Either the number of rapes has increased, either the conversations have increased. But
right,
yeah, that's
Shala,
a big change.
we'll come to that. But I also want to ask from Samreen. You grew up in Baramulla, hub of militancy during 1990s. How were your experiences different from what Shala has just spoken about? Tell me a bit about your growing up.
Yeah. I think basically we need to start from problematizing this very notion that, violence started because militancy was unfolding. I think by this point, the state had already normalized violence to an extent that, during my field work, so I met this woman and I asked her, have you ever been a victim of physical violence by the state or the militants? So she said no. Then during the course of our conversation, I asked about crackdowns and cordon and searches and how frequent they were in their area. And she said, we all would get a beating. Like the men would be taken outside and the women would all get a beating from the forces inside their homes. So I said, why didn't you mention this when I said if you've been a victim of violence? She said, what was there to mention? Wasn't it so normal? Everyone in Kashmir would tell you that this happened, this happened. So also this question is very relative in the sense that when I speak of my experiences of coming from Kashmir, I can speak of it because I'm here. a certain privilege brings me to this point right now, so I can talk of a relative context where I see how different it is for those the state calls its citizens, the rights they enjoy here and the rights that are curbed there. When I was there, that abnormal militarized state structure actually seemed pretty normal to me. So it is in that sense, for someone who has not come out of Kashmir, I think it's a very difficult question to answer because those experiences that you want them to talk about, they're so normal that they would, consider them a part of their everyday life and not something they are being asked about. So it is also in that sense that someone who's been there would not probably even have this imagination to relate it.
Right. Naima, you have also spoken about this in your book, Lost in Terror. What were the challenges you faced as a woman? How did conflict affect your personal and professional life? Could you please speak a bit about that?
Thank you very much, Bridge, for having this first session on Kashmir, and I'm glad that we are talking about Kashmir this time. It was very difficult for me because in early 90s, I had just entered into the media at that time. Earlier, it was society, it was family, it were relatives who were against me. And after this thing happened in early 90s, this insurgency, militancy, whatever you call it, I thought that everybody is now against me. Whether they are in uniform, whether they are civil, because at family level, my father was there to fight against his family because he wanted me to get education. He wanted me to get in media. He wanted my sisters to have all the opportunities available. And he fought. And what happened, me, my sisters, and my father, it seemed sort of that we were ostracized. We had no connections with anybody in family. Our relatives, they just cut off because we were going to schools, colleges, we were having education, and we were going outside. And then when this period happened, because I had joined, after passing through this UPSC, I had joined radio, and I was just going to start this, doing some wonders in media. Militancy started, and one fine morning, my station director is telling me that, look, you have to stay at home because we will have only few men here who will be working in radio now. We don't need you for some time. Although I was on a very good post, but it was my opportunities, they were taken away. And then I had to fight at all fronts, whether it was my family, whether it was media. And there was, I had this control type of freedom at home because it was only my father. He was playing double role. I didn't have mother. I had lost mother when I was a very 6 or 7 years old. It was my father. He was fighting. But then, still, there were men like my father who wanted their daughters to have education, to go in media, to go in law, because earlier I did law. Then I didn't go to law because my relatives, most of my relatives were in court, and they didn't want me to be in high court doing practice. And I had to give up there at that time. But in media, I couldn't just give up again. I thought, no, it's enough what I have done earlier. I continued my fight, and my father was with me, and I did a lot of wonders until in 93, I went to BBC World Service in London and started my career there, though there were also some difficulties because being from militant area, Kashmir, where this, the picture, the stereotype picture of a girl was everywhere. And then women from Kashmir coming to BBC, working there with most of the employees from India and Pakistan. I was sort of a sandwich between two. And, but I tried my best, and then there were people who appreciated my work, and I was at some point, I was made then the Kashmir expert, because at that time we had 42 language services in BBC, and whatever would go on Kashmir, whether it was top headline every time, and I was the point of reference where they would come, check, and then go on air broadcasting about Kashmir. That was something, I mean, that was truthfulness I was doing to the Kashmir story, but I could say it was my ultimate freedom, personal freedom as well as professional freedom. And it was a sort of a satisfaction to me that this time I'm doing justice to my profession as well as I am doing justice to myself as well, my family as well. And then the story went on, and thank God, this time I can see tremendous change in Kashmir. These girls, they are now our third generation. Now they are moving forward. And I think a lot has changed since then. When I started, yes, conflict has done a lot of misery. We have suffered a lot. But still, if we are not marching ahead, we are limping. We are not running, we are limping, and we are moving forward.
Thank you, Naima. Frenny, you have reported and written extensively about Kashmir, and especially about women and children. When you went to Kashmir for the first time in 2010, as an outsider, what were your impressions?
Actually, I went in the tail end of the summer of turbulence, 2010, and I remember Facebooking a friend who was working there, and she said, no, it's not a good time to come. And I said, no, I'm not coming as a tourist, I'm coming as a journalist. And I think this is the other narrative that we have to look at Kashmir, in which at one level it's being played out as this beautiful tourist spot, and then you go in as a tourist and you say कि ये कुछ कोई problem नहीं है. Your shawl wala tells you कि नहीं कोई problem नहीं है साहब, कोई problem नहीं है. And you never enter downtown and you never really realize. And I think for me, coming when there was curfew and shutdown was giving me now a chance to see of just what it's like to live in militarized zones. And when I come in from Bombay, where, you know, relatively, I'm privileged, as you say, on this. And I think my subsequent trips were on realizing just exactly what it is to live day in and day out in a militarized zone. And conflict, yes, it's maybe you never really see the violence, but there's, I think, what one woman journalist wrote so beautifully, the hidden damage. What is it like, I think, to know that there's someone in your field with a gun? What is the gun going to be pointing at but you? What is it like to know, and I think now the CASOs are begun again with great intensity. What is it like if a man intrudes into your house? And I remember this young girl telling me her first impressions of how terrified she was because her mother told him कि इधर कुरान है आप अंदर मत आइएगा. That kind of constant surveillance that you have to live in. The fact that I think in Baramulla, some of the, maybe no further, you have these huge watchtowers. You can't even go into a toilet, like I think with the Handwara girls' experience. And so I think this kind of brought about a big quantum shift in my perception. The fact that a soldier can come into your room, take out your sanitary pads and throw them all over the place. This kind of violation of your privacy, of yourself as a person. So after that, I began exploring other nuances. But I think we have to keep in mind that a militarized zone has its own gender concerns, its own complexities of how women get empowered or not. Suddenly women are coming out to go to police thanas, to go to, and they're still doing it. If you're picked up, you go. And it's interesting because I've just returned from Chhattisgarh and I find this similar militarization pattern there, where it's the Adivasi women who have to now go to the thanas because the men will be picked up and they run away. So this was my first thing of militarization. And my second is, again, as I said, of this larger meta-narrative that the Indian media keeps on pushing. And all you women have spoken of your education, and I find this need to pigeonhole the Kashmiri woman as either suppressed, bichari victim, or then as a person who's a jihadi and who's radical, Islamized and all, as very, very problematic. And I think in the current scenario where there's been this debate on burqas and on hijab, I think do we like to see good feminists, bad feminists? So good feminists will take off her headscarf, and but she can't be a feminist if she's covered her hijab. When I think if you go to Kashmir, you realize just how much you have to break these terrible stereotypes.
Right. Thanks, Freni. Mantasha, you are heading Kashmir Women's Collective. And we were talking about this yesterday. You said gender justice is seen as oppositional to the political justice in Kashmir. You know, women suffer silently in conflict zones. There are, as Freni mentioned, these silent traumas that women face in their day-to-day lives. Unpack that sentence for me. What do you mean by gender justice oppositional to political justice?
Thank you for moderating this event, and thank you for having us here. I think it's very important when we talk about gender in a political conflict, it's very important to contextualize gender. Because in conflict, women face, I would say, not just double, but multiple oppressions. So it's not like any other society where there is one thing you can point at, okay, this is gender injustice. While as in Kashmir, it's entirely different. So you have violence at the level of family, you have violence at the level of community, which has cultural, religious undertones, and then you have violence institutionally, the political violence. So women suffer all these, and I wouldn't say silently always. I mean, Kashmiri women are not as docile as we are perceived to be. We are strong, and you know, we come out on roads, sometimes we pelt stones, sometimes we go abroad, we study. I mean, we use our positionality to be heard, and we have done it forever. But then that can't be done, you know, saying that we'll discount what we face in our personal lives. So there is a sort of, I would say, intersection, or what feminists call intersectionality, between the political oppression and the personal oppression. In fact, in feminism, we don't have the binary of political and personal. It very, very much crosses over. And in Kashmir, you get to actually see it in reality, how personal goes into political and how political goes into personal. Say, for instance, certain cases of women in which Kashmiri women are portrayed, not portrayed, I would say they are widows and they are half widows, and their suffering is a reality. But then portraying women only as suffering in relation to lost men, lost husbands, lost sons is problematic. There are women who are raped. And if you look at, say for instance, at rape used as a war weapon, or you look at rape used on the body of a woman from the perspective of a rape victim survivor, there wouldn't be much difference. If you're, say for instance, a victim survivor of rape, whether an armed person raped you or a community member raped you, looking at that violence or that act of violence through the lens of the victim survivor, rape is rape. But when you look at it from the perpetrator angle, if it's an armed person raping you, then it's a weapon of war. It has a larger connotation. If it's somebody in your locality raping you, then it's just, you know, control, masculine control over a woman. So patriarchy is inherent to institutions and to personal life. And when I talk about Kashmir Women's Collective, like you said, the perception of gender, you know, liberation or gender empowerment as oppositional to political empowerment, it's a reality. In Kashmir, if I'm a woman, which I am a woman, I'm a Kashmiri, I'm a Muslim, I have 3 identities. And why should I be told to pick one identity and leave other 2? Why should I be made to lose a part of my identity on cost of other? If I claim to be a woman here, I am a woman. If I'm a Muslim without a headscarf, I am a Muslim. It's my identity, and nobody has a right to question it. At the same time, if I'm saying that there is violence from armed forces, which is documented, very well documented, and if I'm saying that there is violence from my community also, that shouldn't be seen as, oh, Kashmiri men are the worst, they are bad, they are the worst in the whole subcontinent. They oppress their women, they control their women. I'm not saying that's not the reality, but you have to see what a tight rope Kashmiri women have to walk. If we point at the violence done on us by our community, then we are highlighting how bad our community is, which we don't want to do. But at the same time, if we say that, oh, our community is wonderful, it's the best, we only have state violence or the institutional violence, then we are lying. So imagine anybody in the audience, imagine yourselves in the shoes of a Kashmiri woman who has to guard all these identities constantly. And now also the identity of being a Muslim. I realized that I'm a Muslim when I went to the US, and I was like, back in Kashmir, I went to a missionary school, an English missionary school, and nobody in my classroom covered their heads with a headscarf. And I was like, oh, I'm very, I have a modern upbringing, I'm not going to cover my head. And I wasn't very sure that I would appreciate somebody who would cover a head. But when I went to New York and I saw women wanting to assert their identity through a head cover, I was like, well, very well, if they choose it, why not? And the narrative which I have come across, largely in the subcontinent of South Asia, or even in Kashmir, like Frenny pointed out, there is a good feminist, bad feminist. You can't be a feminist with a headscarf, or you can't be a Muslim without a headscarf. You can't be working for the state and still talking about state violence, or if you are in the resistance movement, you can't talk about gender. Please, let's do away with this. Let's talk about and call out to all forms of oppression, and that's what the attempt is.
Right.
And that's what we do in Kashmir Women's Collective. Thank you.
Thanks,
I hope I didn't take too
Mantasha.
long.
Thank you, Mantasha. Last year there was a report on a news website that said there was a spate in domestic violence cases in Kashmir. And it pointed out the reason was because there was lockdown and men were home, so women had to face the brunt. You were heading the commission at that time. What is your understanding of what was happening?
Yeah, I think the domestic violence cases have increased, but I don't want to say that men have become wild or beasts and that's why this violence is being happened. It's the accumulation of all these events which have happened for the last 3 decades. And I think what I have, observed during discussion with the different women and who are coming to me, I think the endurance level of a woman, the capacity, how much you take in, is gone totally. She doesn't accept this little bickering at home now. Because she used to be very strong, she used to take in too much, bear too much, endure too much. But now, outside violence has left nothing for her. She has taken too much inside that whatever is happening at home, she says this is enough. And she sees this all women, uniform men, gunmen, and when she sometimes symbolizes it with the men at home as well. She says all men are equal and they are doing the same things. And that's why I have seen, because particularly in Kashmir, when women are coming to me that we have this marital dispute at home, and outrightly she is saying, I want divorce. I don't want to stay with this man. And that's a new phenomenon in Kashmir. And that never used to be there, that women, she will come and express her view. So that's one factor. Another factor is the curfews, hartals, men, definitely. And when this post-Burhan period, there was this total shutdown, and women and men were inside the homes, and I got women from downtown saying, what are we going to do? Men are always at home, and they are always fighting. Whatever we do at home, and they are just criticizing all the time. How are we going to get away with this? So these things are so many things, so many factors which are responsible for this domestic violence.
Samreen, do you want to respond to that quickly? Because some might say that it's probably a certain state narrative trying to fracture a society. Do you want to?
First of all, the fact that we talk about the endurance level of women going down or men becoming a certain way is problematic because we essentialize gender and these qualities in a particular way. So women are supposed to be tolerant, men are supposed to be violent, for example. So that becomes problematic, and we don't have to look at it that way. Women and men are not, even in themselves, they are not coherent and unitary groups with homogeneous experiences. Having said that, the problem, I read the report as well. So the first question that came to my mind last year when I read that report was, how do you get this data? I mean, in Kashmir, where you have the police and state structures perpetuating a certain narrative, you have to question this narrative coming from the state. This is not to say that domestic violence does not happen. I do not want to portray our society in like the best light that it might not be. But also, the fact that what we are missing out here is that in all these years of the armed conflict, what has happened is that the state, which is a grand patriarch actually, attempts to subjugate the masculinity of the men, which in turn might show in acts of violence against women. But then also this binary that we create, you know, victims of violence by the militants on one side, by the community on the other, and by the state is problematic for me. Because when we talk of the state, we look at it as the principal focal point vis-a-vis citizens' rights, especially women's rights in this case. So when the state is the protector, obviously the onus lies on the state. So we cannot, you know, equate state violence with militant violence in that sense, because there is no moral equivalence between the two. It would be if the state were to recognize militants as legitimate, then they would say, you know, they are a legitimate actor, so they have committed this violence, so there is an equivalence between their violence and our violence. So these narratives are very problematic in that sense. Also, I think these cases about domestic violence, they are conversations that the Kashmiri society must have, you know, internally. These are conversations that need to be had, and they must be had.
Thank you so much, Samreen. Mantasha, what prompted you? I mean, we are running short of time, so I want quick responses from all of you. What prompted you to start Kashmir Women's Collective? I mean, there are already so many human rights organizations working in Kashmir, and women's rights are human rights. Why this need for a special collective like Kashmir Women's Collective?
A couple of points. One, like Samreen pointed out, there is no moral equivalence between the violence by the state and by militants, for example. We don't need to find out equivalence in order to call out on any form of violence, first of all, I believe. And similar idea, when 2 years ago, some girls in Bangalore were partying, and then they were molested. I was outraged. I was like, why can't I show solidarity with them? And then the question was, do Indian women stand up for Kashmiri women? Did they stand up when Shupian happened? Did they stand up when other incidents happened? And then I was like, should my solidarity be conditional? Can I not just talk about women who are suffering and from all kinds of violence? And we had a conversation. We started a group based on our own experiences of growing up in Kashmir. Like Shaila said, she grew up in downtown, as did I. I grew up in Navakadal area. So when, for instance, I would board a bus and I would be molested, groped, I wouldn't know who to call upon. Say, for instance, I would be working in an office, which I still am. There is no Sexual Harassment Act still in place in J&K. It has been added as an addendum to the Article 354, Section 354 rather, under RPC. But in rest of India, there is a proper POSH Act, which we call. Similarly, Domestic Violence Act in 2010, it was passed, but there are still no shelter homes. There are no proper helplines. I mean, having lived in different parts of the world, I see how institutionalized rape crisis centers are, how women networks run. There is so much support and help for women who have suffered from violence. They don't ask them, oh, is your violence caused by militant? Then it's less. Is it caused by a central armed force? It must be more. Ask the victim survivor of violence when they have no support. So this lack of support on ground prompted me and some other young women to come forward and form this network, irrespective of the violence which the women face. Because after all, understand it from the point of view of the women. Why from the perpetrator? That's my take.
Right. Thank you. We are really running short of time, so I want to open this up. Are there any questions from the audience? We have time for a couple of them. Yes, please, sir. Please introduce yourself and ask our panelists.
My name is Ashwini Gupta. I served in SBI for 40 years as an officer. After my retirement, I've been freelancing for the media and as a trainer, etc. My question is, has the entry of women in the police force and the army been successful in making state violence slightly less oppressive, or has it lowered the incidence of state violence because we have women in the police and the army?
Frenny, you want to take that?
My question is, when women join the army and the police, when they serve in the police and the army, does the incidence of violence by the police and the army, which you have referred to as state violence, does it go down to some extent? Are women police officers or women soldiers, are they more humane in their interaction with the public?
Sure.
Anybody can answer.
Naima ji, why don't you?
I don't know the actual number of the women who have taken up in the security forces and particularly in the J&K police, but definitely we have introduced women police stations in most of the districts of J&K now. And if, I mean, you know, the violence is two types of violence. If it's a personal violence, the women now go to police stations and register that and get FIR lodged and get action done. But the presence of the women in police and other areas, it hasn't made so much visibility yet in J&K, if I am talking about. So, but yes, if there are more police officers, more these women police officers in other security agencies, maybe it might. But this time, I think only domestic violence cases, sexual harassment cases, they are being registered in these police stations. Because you know we have big two cases, rape cases in Shupayan and then Kunan Poshpura, still lingering in the courts, and we don't have so much result yet. So we waiting for that as well. So if there is any other violence relating to security forces, I think you know much better than me what happens to those cases as well.
Samreen quickly wants to make a point.
Yeah, this is like arguing that adding women to an already militarized state structure is going to be good. This is like the Operation Sadbhavna, you know, winning hearts and minds of people. So you rely on militarized humanitarianism by showing a more humane face of the army. So you induct women into an already violent force, expecting them to change the violent into a non-violent force, which I think even from the feminist perspective would be a very problematic argument to make.
Any other questions from the audience? Yes, sir. There.
Thank you. My name is Bashar Ali. I'm a PhD scholar at Jamia Islam. My question is specifically to Mantasha because he said a couple of interesting things. One, you said we use the pronoun we Kashmiri women, we study abroad, we build stones. You have been highlighted as a bureaucrat here. Consider a situation that you are in Srinagar and you are a deputy commissioner. Shaila on your left is in a protest and she pelts stones. And then she is caught pelting stones and you will be the first person to book her under Public Safety Act. So I would really want you to change that, the use of pronouns. Secondly, you said that that these three identities of a Kashmiri, of a Muslim and a woman have to be taken together. And then Marusha asked you a question about which you have had a conversation last night, that the civil resistance movement and the feminist movement have to be, are to be positioned opposite to each other. If I am right, I think the concept of patriarchy and the concept of military occupation, they conceptually work on the same logic. Both require your obedience in order to curb your freedoms.
Quickly,
so, so my question is, can the two not be integrated and not be seen as opposite to each other? Thank you.
I choose not to answer the first question, and the second question I will answer. The second question which you asked is, why can't be they integrated? That's precisely what I'm asking. If, for instance, institutions by the state or of the state are seen as violent and oppressive towards women, I might ask you, are other spaces not violent against women? First question. And had state violence or conflict not been there, would they have been better? That's my counter question. And the second question would be, I mean, they are just talking points and thinking points. Maybe we all need to spend more time thinking about them. If the discourse from the state institutions is problematic, what is the discourse of the civil resistance? Does that include women? How many women are there in powerful positions? How much decision making do they have? So I don't think pitching one against the other helps. Rather integrating, which I said, a discourse which transcends this against that. If the civil resistance movement does not talk about women's rights as human rights, I mean, there is a narrative of human rights in Kashmir so much. Even if you ask a kid, he would tell you or she would tell you, किसी को pellet आ गया तो वो human rights violation है, किसी को गोली आ गई तो वो human rights violation है. लेकिन उस discourse में, उस narrative में, why don't children understand कि किसी औरत पे हाथ उठा तो वो human rights violation है? So that means if the state narratives are problematic, we also need to introspect the narratives at the community level. Are they not problematic? I wouldn't equalize. I wouldn't say, are they not equally problematic? That would, have different answers.
Thanks, Mantasha. We really have to wrap this up, but before that, I want all of our panelists to tell us their last comments on what is the way forward. Can this movement for gender rights in Valley run parallel to the civil resistance movement? Frenny, starting with you, quickly, all of you.
Certainly, I think all over it is going parallel. I wouldn't even say can it go. I think there is a, what is the word we use, intersectionality. It is going forward.
What I feel is that whenever we discuss Kashmir, there is some additional mystic quality that we expect, or something interesting, something mysterious is going on that we don't understand. I think that the one thing that the panel has done is basically demystify the whole thing. Why do we expect anything different to go on in Kashmir? In the left movement, there is interaction with the gender discourse. In any other movement, whatever movement, you take any farmers movement, be it land rights movement, whatever it is, there is always interaction on, say there's, what I'm trying to say is there's always interaction between, say, caste and the main question, gender and the main question. The fact that the panel heading says women and conflict, it obviously means that women are outside of conflict already. The conflict is something that is male-centric. So I think that we shouldn't be afraid of having this discourse, but we shouldn't also sort of over-sensationalize this, because this is a conversation that every movement needs to have. And if the resistance movement fails to have this conversation, then it will have consequences not just for the women, it will have consequences also for the movement.
Thank you, Shaila. Mantasha, quickly.
I would certainly agree with Frenny and Shaila. I don't see gender as something, separate from the existing discourses. Gender is a part of everyday life, and gender is a lens through which you look at everything. Whether you want to look at anything in the world, any aspect of life, if you look through the lens of gender, then only it's more just and I think more inclusive. And any movement whatsoever, which discards it or fails to include it, will have issues, in my understanding.
Naima.
I think despite of all odds, we fought, we survived, we sustained, and we are still living, and we are very strong, particularly Kashmiri women. She is, and she will fight back, and no matter how many moments, resistance moments there will be, but she will get her due place and she will get her respect, which is due to her.
Samreen.
Yeah, I don't think there's this binary between the gender justice movement and that of the largest struggle for right to self-determination in Kashmir. Because if you see the unbridled militarization, which has worked on using the body as a site of violence, it leaves no scope for any imaginary where gender justice can go on with political freedoms. But if you look at the Kashmiri movement for right to self-determination, I think there's a lot of scope for imagination where, gender and the movement, they are actually together. You cannot say women are outside of this movement, as Shaila pointed out. So I think these struggles have to go together, and the conversations have to happen in Kashmir, which they have. If you look at the conversations that are happening in the public sphere about Kunan Poshpura now, they also, there's this notion of honor attached with violence and rape, which these public discourses are now trying to question. So I think this is exactly what both these movements are actually doing. They're not two movements. I think they are a single movement. They're trying to dismantle existing power structures and then also trying to reclaim lost spaces, and that is exactly where they, become one in what they intend to achieve. Thank you.
Thank you so much, all our panelists. Thank you so much for your insight and feedback. I'm afraid we have to wrap this up. Thank you, everyone.